Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show with a fantastic guest, Barbara, who I'll introduce in a moment, who's got a really interesting story as also first generation British, but from an Irish background. It's a fascinating story for me, and one about sort of inherited trauma, which we'll get into. Just a note for folks, we'll be talking about maybe some subjects that are upsetting. Just note for yourself if you're feeling upset, and you can take a break from the show, or you can go and talk to somebody. These subjects can bring up feelings and thoughts and memories, and that's okay. And we'll put out support lines such as Samaritans, etc. You'll see those underneath. But just know if you have some feelings, that's okay. It's all right. We all have feelings, and sometimes they're not great, and sometimes they're good. It's no big problem. But if we do stray into territory, which I think might be triggering, I'll just stop the show and we'll talk about that with Barbara, who's also a health professional, so she understands all of this stuff herself, and we want to have a good time. If you got any questions or thoughts, do send them through to me on WhatsApp +44 7506 319 745, and I can pass them on to Barbara, who I'm sure will be happy to sort of answer any questions. Do remember we recorded this before you watched it, so don't call me during the show because I might be out having a meal or something like that. And I might not be able to answer your questions. So send me a message on WhatsApp. That's the best idea. So that's enough from me. Hi Barbara, how you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Good. Like I said to you before the show, we've got sunshine here in London, which is very welcome, and a warm day as well. It's been pretty cold over here for a while. You're over in the States. Where are you?
I'm in New Jersey, just west of New York, if
Yeah.
you probably more familiar with New York.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
sort of familiar with New York. I've not been to New Jersey. It's sort of a blue collar area, I think, isn't it? Predominantly
It's predominantly what?
like a blue collar working people's area. Is that
Oh,
right?
there is a lot of different areas
Okay.
in New Jersey. There's some very affluent areas.
Yeah.
You're probably thinking more of like Newark and Elizabeth and those big cities.
Yeah.
I live on the Jersey Shore, which is really beautiful.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a
I can
beautiful shoreline.
I can imagine. And how close are you to New York, which would be the reference point for most people?
I'm about an hour and a half from New York. So I'm down in southern New Jersey. And so I gotta go up the parkway and then onto the turnpike. And so it's about an hour and a half.
And have you always been in New Jersey? Is that where you're born and brought up?
Yep, I was born here. I left for 2 years. I lived in San Francisco, and then came back.
Yeah.
And I've lived in various areas in New Jersey, but yeah, it's my home.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. And you have a large family there. You've been very settled there. That's where you grew up. It's sort of, but from a sort of Irish cultural background, isn't it?
Yeah, I have a large extended family, mostly on my dad's side. My siblings have kind of my one sister lives here in New Jersey. My brother now lives in Florida.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
but
he's got the warmth and the sweat. I see.
yeah, it's too
It's
warm in Florida.
landing in Florida once on the airplane. They opened the door and immediately we started soaking with sweat. And I was like,
Yeah.
can you live in this stuff?
We get enough of that in July and August, and that's about all I can
Right.
take.
And so you were part of the sort of Irish diaspora community growing up. Or was there a strong sort of cultural influence, or were you more American?
There was. My grandmother moved to well, it's a nice little community called Montclair,
Yeah.
and a section of it, and there was a section. It was very diverse, the town, but a section of it was pretty much all Irish. There were other immigrants, but they were mostly Irish.
Okay.
And she moved there in 1916. After her husband died, she stayed there, and she and my mother lived there. And when my mother married, my dad and my mother moved in with my grandmother. So we were raised And that wasn't unusual in this community. There were a lot of immigrants with first and second generation descendants. And it was a wonderful neighborhood to live in, because there were always, you can imagine, an Irish Catholic
Yeah.
neighborhood. There were a lot of kids. There were always kids to play with. We were always out in the street playing ball and riding our bikes, and it was a nice close knit neighborhood to grow up in. And the Catholic church was right at the end of our street.
Yeah.
And that was, and our school, Catholic school, we went to Catholic schools at all 12 years.
Yeah.
And that was our world. It was my world anyway. It was Irish Hill and Immaculate Conception Parish.
Right. And you felt very comfortable in that sort of setting. You had a good school and a good set of friendships.
I did feel comfortable, but but I lived my my first, I would say, 15 years feeling like I was going to go to hell, because I couldn't obey all those rules.
Yeah.
And I really lived in fear of going to hell, because that's what they drum into you, if you one false move and, and that's it.
And your thoughts were being monitored by somebody and written down in a book, I seem to remember.
Yeah.
I have to say, my brother and I don't think, because we were in England, I'm not sure whether that changed the dynamic, but we didn't take the church too seriously. I quite enjoyed, as they call it, the smells and the bells. Sunday, smells and bells, best clothes, all that sort of stuff. And we're always very well behaved. But my brother and I used to have a little game with each other about confession, which I'm sure you know much about.
You have confession also?
We did. I was doing, yes.
Oh.
I'm a Catholic boy, well, very lapsed, I have to say, but
Okay.
that's what I grew up in. But my brother and I used to have competition. I suppose I shouldn't admit this. Some priest will tell me off, but we used to think it was hilarious to make up lies about sins we'd committed. We had a competition to see who could get the most prayers, the most punishment. My poor mother would be watching us go,
that is really funny. That was really funny. And I, on the other hand, was so afraid that I was going to forget a sin, and then I would go to hell. In fact, my first confession, I wrote down all of my sins. I can remember it now. There were 32 of them.
Really?
And I wrote them down, and I had to rehearse it, but I wanted to rehearse in front of somebody. So I asked my grandmother, and I think I asked her because she was such a strict Catholic. Right. So I asked her to listen to my sins.
What sort of sins would a child commit? Not very serious ones, I can't imagine. Okay. And so that was, were you close in your family, sort of close with your parents and your siblings? Was that a sort of involved Irish sort of family as well?
Well, I think we were a close-knit family. Yeah. I don't think we really talked about things a lot. No. It certainly didn't talk a lot about feelings.
No.
But we were close, and my parents were strict. Well, my mother was very strict. My dad wasn't as strict. But I mean, we were always cared for, and I think we always knew that we were cared for and felt secure.
Yeah, and it was a sort of safe environment, if at times quite frightening because of the strictness. It's a different generation as well. I mean, I think our views of child rearing from that time are very different to new child rearing.
That's true. Yeah.
But your parents weren't unpleasant. They loved you, and you knew that sort of thing.
Yes.
Yeah, but they had a certain set of parenting skills, which I guess today would feel out of place, right? But it's of their time. And you went to school there. What was school like for you growing up?
Well, we were taught by nuns. They were very strict.
Yeah.
They were, and in fact, they explained to us in no uncertain terms exactly what hell was like.
Right.
And because when I was young, I thought that, I knew I couldn't be good enough to stay out of hell. So I thought I had a really good plan, and I felt I could fool God. I'll just pretend that I'm good, and God won't know. Until before we made our first confession, the priest came in to the room and to help us prepare. And I remember him saying, Father McCarthy, and I remember him saying, you know, you can fool your parents and you can fool your teachers, but you cannot fool God.
Right.
Well, my whole plan, you know, went up, and I got so nervous, and that's when I feel like, well, I better really remember all my sins and tell my sins. But yeah, so but then so the nuns explained to us that, you know, hell is forever. And just so you understand what forever is, if you take all of the grains of sand on every beach in the world, and and each one was a year, that forever is longer than that. So
Wow. Wow.
so I mean,
That's
it
a
was,
frightening prospect, isn't it?
oh my God.
Good Lord. Good Lord. Well, sort of.
But you know, a lot of the nuns were from Ireland themselves, and the church in Ireland was so repressive and so restrictive.
Well, there's some really unpleasant things that happened
Yeah,
in Ireland. These days, Ireland is very different, of course.
yeah,
The church doesn't have the same power,
yeah,
and nor should it. I think
yeah.
you know, that there's a separation now of church and state,
Yeah.
and
Well, the church was really the only support that the Irish people had.
right.
And so they turned to the church, and they, you know, so they gained a lot of power.
Yeah, it's also I think sometimes it's the case, and I remember this being the case with my father and mother, that the diaspora communities retain elements of culture that shift in the home country, so that it's almost like, because it's not a dynamic ongoing culture in the same way, and sometimes it
Mhm.
lets go of certain elements of culture, but you
Yeah.
might find certainly certain generations of immigrants, older
Hmm.
generations of immigrants, fiercely hold on to what they remember, when
Yes.
back in the home country it's all changed anyway.
Yeah.
Things
Yeah.
do change, and so the culture ossifies to some extent,
Yeah.
and maybe even becomes a little bit more extreme, I think, to some extent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there was this devotional Catholicism
Mm.
that was very emotional. I mean, the hymns, and a lot of the, like the benediction, it was very emotional. And I remember this as a kid,
Mm.
very uplifting. You know, it kind of, you know, just lifted you up, and you know, it was beautiful. But there
Yes.
was a lot of that devotional Catholicism,
Yeah,
that
I
the
remember
immigrants
some
brought.
of that. You don't get it so much, and I miss it, because
Yes,
I
yeah,
even I put it in simple language, smells and bells. Did like that. I remember as a
yeah,
child being very attracted to it. It was
yeah.
very moving and touching. And I remember going to the main Catholic church in Paris once when they had a sung mass on, and it was extraordinary. I mean, it just
Mhm.
took me
I
away.
bet.
It
Yeah,
really does. I mean, it's sort of just, they
yeah,
had a huge brazier of frankincense, and this choir was singing,
yes.
and in this extraordinary space. And it just, I remember I was so overwhelmed, I had to sit down, and I was just like
Uh,
transported.
was that Notre Dame?
Yes.
It
Yes.
was Notre Dame. Yeah, that's a beautiful, I was there a few years back.
Yeah,
Beautiful.
yeah. I think they've just finished all the repairs on it now. So
That's what I heard. Yeah.
yeah, the scaffolding was coming down the other week. So I might pop over to Paris and jump in there. It's such a beautiful place.
Yeah, yeah.
But I remember those things. There's something interesting. I wonder what you think about this as well. There's something interesting about certainly these more expressive forms of religion, which help us tolerate difficult circumstances. And
Hmm.
I think
Yeah,
that's a conversation we may come back to later on about trauma and post-traumatic growth.
yeah.
But certainly you find in cultures such as the Irish culture, which was very traumatized, was very poor, certainly your grandmother's story,
Hmm.
because life was so grim. One of the ways of dealing with it was turning to the church and different
Hmm.
processes, and having some sense that there was a purpose and meaning to this suffering.
Right, right. And you'll get your reward as long as you obey
Yeah.
all the rules. You get your reward at some point in time after you die.
And
So,
it helps people in a very sort of psychological way. It helps people.
yeah.
But it also can, and I think this is the other side of it, we may discuss that later, it also can lock in unpleasant psychological processes as well,
Yes.
because it
Yes.
stops people from challenging what's happening, challenging abuse and challenging, the
Yes,
power of the church and all that. We know those stories, right?
yes,
About the
yeah,
power of the priests and locking in abuse. So let's continue with your
yes,
story. We'll come to those themes a bit later on. So
yeah.
you're a little girl in all of this stuff, and you're being told this stuff, and you're sort of thinking you might go to hell. So you're behaving very well. You complete school. At some point, you're going to become a nurse. How did that happen? Sort of at what point do you remember deciding, oh, I want to be a nurse, I want to work in hospitals? Was it always there, or?
It wasn't always there. No, I decided when I was a senior in high school. And at that time, there were three main professions for a woman. You could be a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary.
Okay.
And most of the girls in my class, that's what they did. Well, and my dad was an educator, and he wanted me to be a teacher, and I just didn't. That didn't. I couldn't see me doing that.
Yeah.
And so I decided that I wanted to be a nurse.
Okay.
So
Do you
I
remember
never
being
regretted it.
attracted to that just because it was the least unpleasant option, or were you actually thinking that?
Well, at that time, there were all those shows on television, the hospital show, Ben Casey, and oh, what was the other one? I can't remember the name of it now. But there were so it was kind of romanticized for me. So that's part of the reason too. But no, I had never, it's not one of the things that I wanted to be my whole life. No,
Okay.
no, it's no.
So you decide to train as a nurse. At some point, you then get, I guess, a husband and a family of yours. Where does
No, no, I didn't go that route. No.
it go that way? Oh, great.
No, no, I spent a lot of my time in my career.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so and advancing in my career.
Okay.
And so
How did
that's
your family feel about that? That's quite a shift. That's plowing your own furrow away from.
yeah, well that's another thing at that time. Now this is in the 60s and 70s, people were choosing a lot of times not to get married, and
Right.
the culture was changing a bit. And I had when I graduated from college, because I did go to college for nursing school, and myself and three of my friends decided to move out to San Francisco
Okay.
because that was up and coming. And so we did. And of course, we were met with the summer of love. And here we are, four Irish Catholic girls in
Wow.
San Francisco, and it's the summer of love. And and that was a culture shock.
Well, one hopes you committed a lot of sins during that time
Yeah.
and
Yep.
thoroughly enjoyed
I
them.
made up for all those times that I didn't.
Good for you.
And that opened my eyes to a whole different way of living. I think the 50s were kind of very restrictive, and you fit into certain roles. And this was, it just opened my eyes to other, I mean, I was really very struck with the hippies. I didn't become one myself, but
Yeah.
I really was very very taken by them and their lifestyle.
Okay.
And so it was an eye opener for me.
Right. Did you
Um,
experiment yourself? You don't have to incriminate yourself. We can sort of talk around the subject.
I didn't, no,
Okay.
no.
So you passed that by, but you enjoyed all the rest of that lifestyle.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Music and the free love and the good relationship.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And all the bars and I mean, we would go out at night. I don't know how, and when I think back on it, I don't know how we did it, but we would go out at night to the clubs and come home at 4 o'clock in the morning, sleep for an hour, and be at work at 7.
Right.
And so that you got to young to do that.
I guess. Absolutely. I think it's only youth explains that sort of crazy.
That's right. That's right. But
Certainly don't do it.
it was
But
great. It was great. And after 2 years, I said, okay, I think I've had enough.
and you went back to New Jersey to
Yeah, yeah,
you were in nursing, general nursing at the time you told me. And
yes,
right.
yes. Mm.
And
Yeah,
which
I worked in a major medical center, was in the suburban area in critical care. And then I decided that I really wanted something different. I was, I was developing this social conscience, and I had read about these Needle Park in New York, where
Yeah.
addicts went to, to shoot up, and they would, were sick and whatnot. And it was so different from anything that I was ever exposed to, except for my short time in San Francisco. And so I decided to go work in substance abuse. And so I did that for several years. And then I went into the field of psychiatry.
Okay. And in psychiatry, you didn't become a psychiatric nurse, but you worked as a general nurse with psychiatric patients with.
Well, yes, I was certified as a psychiatric nurse. I had advanced degree in psychiatric nursing. And but I worked in a general hospital, and it was an acute care hospital. And I worked with patients who would come in who would be very seriously ill.
Yeah.
Cancer, AIDS, whatever. And I would work with them to just to support them through the whole process, to help them to find their inner strengths, to use their strengths, to support them, to listen to them, to do whatever I could to help them through the really rough period.
Right. And these were also patients who had psychiatric issues, is that right?
They may have had, or they may not have. They didn't necessarily have, no.
Okay.
No.
So what attracted you to sort of retrain in psychiatry, do you think, and get that qualification?
You know what, I think it was, I became very fascinated by the mind.
Okay.
And I really I did a lot of reading. And I was mostly interested in depth psychology. That's the one area that really drew me. It still does.
Okay.
And I followed, I didn't have any extra training in Jungian psychology, but I did do a lot of reading, and I followed a lot of Jungian, that kind of thinking.
Okay.
And
what was the attraction there for you? So for people who don't know, that's often what Jungian thinking is called depth psychology.
you know what? I liked how they conceptualize human beings.
Okay.
And I felt like that the strict psychiatric conceptualization became more, particularly like in the 90s, became more of a focus on biology.
Yeah.
And it just didn't fit with what with how I like to see, how I like to conceptualize human beings. And I also got involved in a lot of holistic, which is another, I think, looking at people as being whole people rather than, parts. That also kind of resonated with me. So I used a lot of holistic strategies when I was treating the patients.
And did you also, within the sort of research you did into depth psychology, the reading, etc., did you put yourself into Jungian sort of
I
analysis?
didn't, no.
Okay. You wanted to avoid that, or it just wasn't?
No, actually, at one point I was really looking for a Jungian psychologist in the area, and I couldn't find one.
Right.
And then but
I guess in all this reading then and this work that you were doing, I mean, I have to say I agree with you. I think the reductionist medical model of mental health is of limited use, to be honest.
Yes.
Really limited use. And I think it is also beginning to die out now, I think. I've got a good close friend of mine who's a junior doctor who's going to be doing her psychiatric residency. She's the new breed of psychiatrists who are not that interested in just the medical.
Oh, good. That's good to hear.
Much more interested in psychology.
Yeah.
Maybe that's always true of the younger ones. They get sort of broken by experience, maybe.
Yeah.
But I think that we are moving away from that. And I think that we're moving into much more psychosocial and psychological models and in a realistic way. And I think, my feeling, without getting on board a soapbox, is that a lot of damage was done to the field of psychology by sort of very regressive models, the analytic models that were sort of very political and aggressive, And modern psychology is very different, I would have to say. But you were attracted to this idea of the conceptualization of humans as having, and I think it may be relevant to sort of your then research into your own background, but this idea of transpersonal issues, if you like, which is one of the core issues within Jungian psychology, the notion that there are, people may have heard the term archetypes, and you can think of them.
Yes. Yeah.
And so it's things that are transmitted culturally and psychologically that became of interest to you. Is that right?
Yeah. 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 A much more expansive view of people and what they're and what helps them through, and there's I don't know, there's just so many fascinating aspects that
But also, although we've talked a bit lightly about it, because I just wanted people to have a sense of your own personal history. Some of the issues that you brought up with about having, and it's in your book as well, having a grandmother who was clearly quite traumatized and would have passed that on to your mother, who passed it on to you, and you lived in that family, and you lived in a culture which was trying to manage through the church quite destructive processes that had happened in Irish culture. So all of those things were there, weren't they? They sort of that story and the translocation of a culture out of context in a different country, and all the issues that come from that. And you as a woman, with the changes that took place, that were phenomenal in 60s and 70s. They're still phenomenal. But I went to school in the 70s and I remember those changes. And I went to school when there was one conception of gender. I left school and the conceptions of gender thrown out of the water. Gone.
It was very freeing. That time was very freeing. It was like all these restrictions kind of just fell to the wayside, and it was very freeing.
Yeah. You said that you had quite a challenging relationship with your grandmother. Are you okay to talk about that? What that was?
Yes, I can talk about it because actually, I told you about how my grandmother we just didn't get along, and at one point I just told her that I hated her. She did something. She kind of just not destroyed. Well, we had a really nice bedroom that my mother had put together for my sister and I. I was about 7, and we had new bedspreads and new beds, and it was just so nice. And I came home from school one day, and my grandmother had decided that the bedspreads were too big for the bed. So she took one bedspread, ripped it in half, put one half on one bed and the other half on the other. And I don't know what she did with. Well, I came home from school and I was furious. So I went downstairs and I told my mother. My mother didn't say anything. And my sister didn't say anything. It was her room too. So I was furious. So I got a bunch of index cards. And I laid them out, and I wrote on one. I had one word for each index card. I hate you, Mary Sullivan. And I tacked it up on her bedroom door. And that's where the title of the book comes from, actually. So I mean, we were always we just did not get along, and she was very critical of me. She was critical of she was just very irritable. She would talk to herself all the time, out loud, more than she would talk to us. And then as time went on, she got more and more reclusive, and I just tried to ignore her. Eventually, she was diagnosed with dementia. And she was placed in a nursing home where she died 2 years later. And I was very relieved. I was glad that she was gone, actually. And I thought, a chapter, and I don't have to think about her ever again. And then and it's a mystery to me to this day how this happened, but I all of a sudden just became 50 years later. I'm now approaching 70, and I am all of a sudden remorseful about the fact that she died alone in a nursing home, far from the roots that she created in this little Irish neighborhood. And I had this persistent feeling that I had to do something to heal this relationship.
Okay.
And that was the I was impelled to go back to Ireland and to find out what her life was like and to see it and to try to understand. And that was really the motivation for the book, because I started writing things down.
Right.
And I was hoping someday it would become a book, but I didn't know at that point that it would.
And your mum within all of this, is she still alive, your mother? Is it okay?
No.
And so
She died before this. I had this this urge to heal the relationship. She died in the early 90s.
how was she in this relationship that between you and your grandmother? What was that like?
My mother
Quite
was
afraid of
submissive.
her own mother, I guess.
She was very submissive to my with my grandmother.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because my dad, who was the most patient person you could ever want to meet, he I always thought it was his, well, it was his job. He was a principal of a grade school. And so he had a lot of after work things to do, but he wasn't home a lot at night. And I as an adult looking back, I realized, I wonder if he was avoiding being home, because there was always this, my mother was always, not having to appease my father, but wanted to, be a wife to her husband. And my grandmother could be very demanding. And my mother had said at one point that if she would have destroyed her marriage if she had let her.
Right.
And so, so there was this whole dynamic that I didn't realize as a kid. I just thought that was normal. But thinking back on it as an adult, I could see how how hard that could be for my mother.
Yeah,
But
quite.
she could never confront her.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because in thinking about inherited trauma and the communication patterns, it started to make sense to me.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that people who went through the oppression in Ireland do not talk about it. I mean, it's like other people who have been traumatized, but they don't talk about it.
Yeah.
And there is this Louise Catman, who well, she's expired now, but she was a psychotherapist and a human development expert.
Yeah.
And she worked with Holocaust survivors and their offspring. And she described her theory of what she thinks happens. And what she said was that when the people are silent, they don't want to expose their children to the horrors that they live through.
Yeah.
So they don't talk about it. They keep it in. And it takes a lot of psychological energy to keep all of that in and not communicate it in any way. And that hampers other caregiving communication patterns. Yeah. It inhibits the ability to be able to empathize with the child. Yeah. So the child senses that and realizes that they have to protect themselves. And not only that, but they sense the suffering that the parent has, the unspoken suffering that the parent has been through, and they have to protect and empathize with the parent. Yeah. When I read that, I couldn't believe that. So resonated with me, because that's exactly what happened. I felt in our family that I always wondered why my mother didn't confront my grandmother. Why did she let her get away with it? That just didn't seem normal to me. Yeah. And why didn't she protect me from all the criticisms? Like she should have been that buffer. Yeah. And then it just clicked, because she had to protect her mother and she had to protect herself.
That's right. Yes.
So now there's no energy left. And I was the middle child. And I think that my brother and my sister were more compliant. Okay. And so I think that's a kind of, I got that,
Have you ever talked about this with your siblings as adults? And or or do they, or the,
I didn't, well, not in any depth, but
okay,
what I did, I couldn't figure out how I was the one in the family who just, I couldn't understand why people tolerated it.
yeah,
And, I always had to strike back and nobody else did.
yeah.
So I went to my sister and I said,
Since you were operating in that scapegoat role, weren't you? You're the person who's has
yeah,
you.
yes,
You're the bad person. You have it dumped on you, but you fight back, like a lot of scapegoats do. So
yeah,
I'm a huge
yeah.
step this.
And,
I
and
would
a lot of
be a
middle,
victim. Yeah,
yeah. So anyway, so I said to my sister, I said, what did you think of Nana? And she said, well, she said, I just thought she was kind of depressed.
yeah.
So then I went to my brother and I said, what did you think of Nana? And he said, well, she was kind of just there. And I was so struck with the intensity of my reaction
Yeah, fine,
to the
fine.
grandmother, and theirs was like no, there was no emotion attached to their whole memory of my grandmother. That just
It's in a
really,
sense it is directed at you, so they didn't get it. So they were just sort of, you protected them in some way by playing that role. So that they,
well, I think yeah, because my brother will always say, he's younger than I am, and he'll say, you paved the way. I didn't have to
yeah,
do,
yeah,
I
no,
didn't have to,
absolutely. You did
because you
that
paved the
throughout your
way.
life, didn't you? You really did that. Now, it's really interesting, and maybe you said you don't know why, but at some point you wanted to shift that internal relationship. You felt some
Yeah,
sense in which I need to make a change here. You might use the word amends. Amends sometimes gets erroneously called an apology. Sort of amends, amending a relationship is changing it because we're uncomfortable with it and we
yeah,
want to do something about that discomfort.
yeah,
So you experienced,
yeah. I wanted to understand what made her the person that she was.
and why was that important to you? Not the reason why you decided, but what about understanding it were you hoping to get if you understood it?
I guess I was I'm not, I don't know, to be honest. And I thought maybe that would just help in the healing if I knew her better. And it was very frustrating because I didn't know anything about her life. I wanted to know about her life in Ireland. And I
Yeah.
thought that understanding her maybe would make me accept her.
Okay.
Um, so anyway, I read a lot about the history of Ireland in the time period that she lived there with her family.
Which would have
And
been what time?
pardon?
What time period would she have
Oh,
been?
and that was the last quarter of the 19th century. So, because she was born in 1877.
So for people who are listening, what was going on in Ireland during that time? What was
Okay, well, it was after the famine.
yeah,
It was 25 years after the Great Famine, but there was also another famine in Ireland at that time. And although there was a lot of hunger, there was not a lot. There was not a lot of death.
okay.
That went on for about 2 years. So it was that famine, but there was also what they called it the agrarian uprising,
Mhm.
because the tenant farmers and the farm laborers. Now, my grandmother's father was a farm laborer. They were the poorest of the poor. They were attempting to get the land back from the British the landowners. They were the landlords.
Yeah.
And they had all this land, and they would rent it to the tenant farmers,
Mhm.
and then the tenant farmers would sublet, I would guess you would say, maybe an acre or so to the farm laborers. So they were fighting to get their land back. And they because the landlords could raise the rent at any time they wanted for any reason. And if they didn't pay, they would evict them, the tenant farmers. And or they could evict the farmers for any reason whatsoever. So they had no rights at all. So they were fighting for this. And it was supposed to, I think, be peaceful, but it got violent at times. And there were, the British would go in if they didn't pay the rent. Or if they were evicting, the British would just go in. If they refused to leave, they would just go in and forcibly evict them.
Mhm.
And they just we're gonna get them out one way or another.
Yeah.
And
That would have
so
been a disaster for families because it was a subsistence economy. People were living on the food that they grew. There was no,
right,
if
that's
you didn't
exactly
have
right.
that, you had no sustenance whatsoever. So it's
That's
quite
right.
disastrous sort of result.
That's right. And they formed leagues, and they went through Ireland, and they tried to get people involved in one of the things they said was don't pay the rent. If they raise the rent, don't pay the rent.
Hmm.
And if many people do that, then they thought that the landlords would give the land over to them. So all of this was going on at the time that my grandmother lived there, and I don't have any evidence that they were evicted, but that thought, I think, was always would always be hanging over your head, so to speak.
And also, and I think people don't understand this, but in many ways, Ireland was under occupation, and
Yeah,
although nominally not, but it was literally under occupation by an occupying army. Power
yes,
was arbitrary, life was harsh and difficult. It never got easy.
yeah, a lot of poverty.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So those were the conditions at that time. And when I went to Ireland, I knew of a historian who was in the area and knew a lot about the families generations ago who had lived there. He was able to find my grandmother's home,
Wow.
and he brought us there, and I had such a feeling of dread going and looking at the house and looking and imagining. Now it had been updated since that time, but imagining what it was like at that point in time. And I just had started to have this feeling of compassion for my grandmother that I could never have when she was alive.
Yeah.
And also a respect for her. Um, because she alone, just left because well, at the time that she left, I have to say that the tenant farmers had gotten the land from the British landlords,
Yeah.
and so they were able to get their land back. But then there was also the fight for independence, and that was beginning to go on. So I don't know the reasons why my grandmother left, but I suspect it had more to do with the fact that she was a woman, she was Catholic, she was a servant, and she was single.
Mm.
And her family, I'm speculating, didn't have money for a dowry, which means that she would never marry.
Mm-hmm.
And she had an older sister, so if they did have a dowry, it would probably go to her. So I thought that my thinking was that she saw that there was no place for her in the country, and so she came alone, and she was almost 30 when she left. She came in 1907. And she always said she was 26. She always made her age a lot younger than she was, and changed her birth date. And I don't know why she did that. We always celebrated her birthday on September 11th. Come to find out from the research I did that she was born on July 15th. So that's a mystery to me why she did that. In any event, I began to see her as somebody who had a lot of courage.
Right.
And
That's the word that was coming to mind. I didn't want to impose upon the narrative, but quite clearly a courageous person.
Yeah. And she had 4 siblings. She was the only one that left. And when she was here after several years, she sponsored her younger brother to come over. But her other siblings, well, one went to England and the other 2 stayed in Ireland. So she came, and she worked as a domestic. She got married. She married a chauffeur. From anything that I could read when I went back to try and investigate this, he was, a very good husband, supported the family, took good care of them. And so from all outward observations, she really made a good life for herself here.
Yeah.
I think internally, though, there was still all of that. So
So let's define that. So tell me about what you understand trauma to be? Because we're talking about the inheritance of trauma. So what's your understanding of what that means? Because I think that word now is losing currency. It's like a bit, I mean, a little bit of despair about how people are using it these days. You stop.
I know. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not true.
So
Tell me
yeah,
about trauma. Yeah.
well, are you talking about inherited trauma
Well,
or
let's talk about what you
just
mean by trauma first.
trauma?
Let's talk about how you understand inherited trauma and how it gets inherited.
Okay, well, so I see trauma as somebody who has been through something that is you don't normally experience in your lifetime.
Yeah.
You know, a veteran from war would experience trauma.
Yeah.
A family who was subject to repeated domestic abuse would suffer from trauma. What the trauma that I talk about in the book is a specific type of trauma. Some call it historical trauma, but it's when a group of people, cultural group, ethnic group, racial group, are oppressed, tortured, or whatever, simply over an extreme, after a long period of time, extreme, I want to use the word trauma, but that's, but after a while, I guess they kind of adapt to it, but it leaves their mark on that. Any of those examples of trauma can do that.
So it's not just an individual, but it's more of a cultural.
It's a cultural, and what it does it erodes their identity. It divorces them from their traditions, and yeah. So that's what I would say trauma is, and I think that leaves you know, when we think of how we respond to danger, and they've all been in these dangerous situations. We have a whole physiological response to it that gets us ready to fight or flee. And the hypervigilance, being able to focus, all those physiological things that go into play. Blood pressure goes up, pulse goes up. And so then when that happens when you are faced with danger. But then what happens after that is that that mechanism can be turned on at any time, even if you're not in danger. And that's when we see post-traumatic stress disorder.
So we're talking about things that are related but not the same thing. So PTSD, I think more and more people understand it. It's an individual response to threat, particularly when confronted with the possibility of death of some form or another. Coming back to this sort of cultural thing, what was interesting for me is listening to you. You're a really intelligent, thoughtful, well-researched woman, professional woman. But even you were feeling that overwhelm, I think, when trying to put this thing into words. And there's something about this form of trauma, which it is silencing, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah.
It's almost impossible to describe it. And part of the response to it is to be very silent, but to express it behaviorally. When you did this research and you visited your grandmother's home and you got this insight into what was happening, how did it change your insight and understanding into her behaviors now? And you're thinking now as an adult woman, you're thinking mature woman, thinking back on these experiences with this new insight.
You know what? It helped to explain her irritability. And
constantly on edge anyway, because
she's the irritability, and things like if you would flush the toilet, she would say, "Why are you flushing that toilet so loud?" When really there's only one way to flush it. But
interesting. I'm going to give you a little personal info on me as well. So like when you're talking about your grandmother, I'm thinking of my mother because she had these things. She had to control everything. You couldn't make sounds. You had to take your shoes off. Everything had to be in exactly the right place. And my mother comes from a family that were heavily involved in the provisional IRA. I don't really often talk about this very much, but her father was very much involved in that, and that intercommunal violence, which was inherited from what your grandmother went through.
Hmm.
So it led to the thing in the 70s, the troubles in the 70s. And so when you're describing your grandmother, you're literally describing my mother as well. And these
Oh, really?
patterns are really embedded. And
Yeah.
this sort of anger, yeah, my mother was a very loving person as well. She wasn't unpleasant or horrible, but she inherited these behaviors, which are very familiar to me.
Yeah.
And it's very familiar in Irish culture as well. It really is. So there's an interesting view from outside of Irish culture of the laughter and the erudition and the culture and stuff like that. But when you're in the culture, you also see the darker side of it. That,
Mhm.
if you like, sadness that you were describing, because actually there's a lot of depression there as well.
Depression, anxiety. She's very anxious. Yeah.
Yeah.
That and when we talk about inherited trauma,
Yeah.
and the epigenetic
Right.
theories about inherited trauma, that really interested me because my when I was a pre-adolescent, I was about 11 or 12 years old.
Yeah.
And I started to get these inexplicable, very anxious feelings, thinking that somebody was going to break into our home and kill us or do whatever. And it didn't make sense because we lived in a very safe neighborhood. There had been no break-ins, and it was a very, very safe neighborhood.
And everybody knew everybody, so who was going
Right, everybody knew,
right?
and not only that, but a detective in town lived right next door. And I mean, the houses were so close together, you could kind of reach out and touch so I mean, it didn't make any sense.
Yeah.
And the other thing, so I had that anxiety. And then there was a rumor going around that the world was going to end in 1960. And
How many of those have there been?
I know, but you know what? I was convinced that the world was going to end. I was not going to live beyond the age of 15, and
Right.
I accepted that. That was just the way it was going to be.
Yeah.
And then the whole thing about hell, I had to, but I'm going to go to hell. So, I mean, it was really very disturbing.
Yeah, quite.
And but what really struck me about inherited trauma and inherited epigenetically is that I wondered, when I thought about the content of my anxiety,
Yeah.
I wondered if that had anything to do with my grandmother,
Yes.
um,
Yeah.
fearing eviction from her home and having the British come in, invade their home and kick them out. And then I wondered also if I thought the world was going to end. This is what the rumor was. The world was going to end by nuclear blast, bombing. And
Mhm.
so I thought, I wonder if that had anything to do with any bombing that was going on, at that area. So and that theory just seemed to fit so much with my experience. Um,
And
I,
there's quite a lot of research that supports that. And so one of the things we do, there is like in psychotherapy, there's the old theory of regression, regress into your mind and all that sort of stuff, which I said comes from the Freudian tradition, which is misplaced. It isn't like that. So these days in modern psychological therapy, we do ask people to try and research their families for exactly that reason.
yes.
So to just explain to people what this means, epigenetics is, so you've got genetics and epigenetics. So your genetics are the color of your eyes. Nothing much is going to
Right.
change that. You do the sperm meets the egg, the color of the eyes is decided at that point. But epigenetics, that's the aspect of your genetic code which can be impacted upon by environmental circumstances.
Correct.
It's
Yeah.
it's how your genetics adapt and they have to adapt, otherwise we'd have died out as a species a long time ago.
Right.
But also this stuff that you're talking about is the inherited trauma through the amygdala, and there's been some really good research, what's known
Yeah.
as unknown knowledge. So there was
Well, the thinking with the epigenetics is that the when you've had this trauma,
Yeah.
A tag is implanted on
Yeah.
that gene.
Yeah.
And that tag can turn that gene on and off.
Yeah.
And so it can turn it on at inappropriate times.
Yeah.
And that is what's transmitted, you know, with the gene, just
Yeah.
like the gene with the eye color, that
Right.
tag goes right along with it.
Yeah.
And so so the descendants can have the symptoms of PTSD without ever having had the experience of that trauma.
And bizarrely, it's a survival mechanism, because the idea of encoding these things is that the next generation has that knowledge without having to experience it. And hopefully
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
tag switches on and they avoid that danger. That's
Yeah.
the point about it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting you got involved in sort of addiction stuff, because again, that's often connected to this epigenetic trauma. And addiction is often thought of as a survival mechanism, although
Yes.
it's bizarre to think about it in those terms.
No, that makes sense. It really does.
It's
Yeah.
this obsession with something, the obsession to
Yeah.
survive, because
Yeah.
often you have trauma outcomes can be either that type of obsessional holding on, or it can be the destructive, depressive death. And
Mhm.
so, and there's been some really interesting studies looking at what they call the trauma diamond.
Mhm.
And trauma is inherited through 7 generations, and you can often, and your grandmother sounds like one of those people. She's at the top of the diamond, and then it went down like this, and then it comes down like this. The interesting thing, and again, research shows this, and I'm really fascinated that you have this intuitive desire to understand. That research shows that if we understand, we don't have to replicate.
Mhm.
We don't have to pass it on, because we
Mhm.
can become aware of these processes, and therefore we
Well,
don't.
you know what? I'm going to tell you what the thing was that blew me away more
Yeah,
when I was writing this book. And you know, like it's fairly easy to heal a relationship when one of the persons is dead,
yes,
because the irritant is gone,
that's
you
right.
know?
Absolutely.
But what came out of all of this is I have another family member who I didn't get along with that much, you know, and it has helped to heal that relationship in the present.
That's great.
That is the miracle.
One things it's really one of the things I did, and this is again making these transformative journeys, because I think I really believe in them. These
Yes, I do too.
heroic journeys, are very important in human culture.
Yeah.
It has changed things. Now I remember it's not the same, but it's similar, it's connected. I remember sort of one of my aunts who lives in Donegal. She was very she always carried a lot of guilt about our childhood, my childhood. She introduced my mother and my father. It was quite a difficult childhood because of the drunkenness and trauma and stuff like that. So a
Mhm.
familiar story. But I remember I made a journey to her to let her know. And again, this is this thing about knowledge and learning and moving into more of that compassionate place with
Mhm.
oneself, with others, right?
Mhm.
And it was important to me for her to understand that I had good memories of her. And so I made that journey,
Oh,
to say, make that amend and say, this memory of this, tell me about this. And she told me about some
oh, how
apples,
nice.
stories around apples. And I tried to capture some leprechauns, because my uncle had told me that leprechauns lived in rocks on the beach. I was breaking open never caught a leprechaun, so I have to go back and find one. So those sharing those things because I had healed, and I had healed because I'd learned about these things,
Mm-hmm.
and it can stop then, can't it? It
Well,
can.
yes, that's the thing.
Really
Yeah.
interesting, because right at the beginning of the conversation, we are at the end of the conversation, but right at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about how parents want to protect their kids from these awful things, and so they keep silent about it. But by keeping silent, in a sense, what they do is they force us to repeat.
Yes.
There's something very healing about being able to give a proper story
Yes.
to events.
Yes. And a lot of the experts who work with people encourage them to go back to the original trauma.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize it, but that's what I was doing.
Yes.
I didn't, when I was writing this book, I did not think I was writing about inherited trauma.
Yeah.
I didn't even realize that that was a term, to be honest with you. And
Yeah.
it wasn't until I was finished, and actually I did an afterword in the book explaining that, I just wanted to heal a relationship. I didn't know I was talking about inherited trauma, but in looking back, it just
Yeah.
it just that's and then there was my grandmother's trauma, but then she was raised by parents who lived through the famine, who were raised by parents. I know one of them survived the Great Famine. I don't know what happened to the others. I can't find any information. So they very well could have died. So that's in that she inherited trauma,
Yeah,
and it
absolutely.
just
Yeah. Yeah. So we are at the end, unfortunately. I told you the
Huh,
hour would fly by, as it
yeah.
always does. So tell us the title of the book and how people can get hold of it.
Okay, it's called I Hate You, Mary Sullivan, a memoir of inherited trauma.
Yeah. Have you got
It's
a
a
copy there? Can you show us?
yeah, I have it right here.
Wonderful. Is that you? Is that your writing?
Yeah, right. Yep, on the index cards. And it's available in paperback and in ebook on Amazon.
Okay. So when the show goes out, we'll put a link so that people can purchase it.
Great. You know what? I just would like to, if we have time, I'd like to mention one other thing.
Yeah, please.
There is an organization. I have it right here. I'm going to pull it up. Because I would like for people to be aware of it. It's called the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma.
Wow.
Because I mean, there are so many people from different countries, and well, I mean, there's so many examples, I guess, of inherited trauma. You have the a displacement of the Native Americans,
Yeah.
enslavement of the African Americans. You have people who have been through genocides,
Yeah.
wars.
Yeah.
There's so many examples, and this is an organization that's committed to try to can I just read for you what their goals are?
Please, I'd be lovely to.
Okay, to raise awareness of the large-scale suffering of trauma, to prevent its destruction from being transmitted to future generations. It's made up of an international interdisciplinary group of experts that guide the research on generational trauma. They devise strategies for interventions and serve as a clearinghouse for up-to-date knowledge on the subject.
Okay, give us the web link, and we'll make sure I publish the link as well. What's the www?
I can give you their email, and they do webinars, which are very interesting.
Yeah.
They just are
We'll
doing
make sure we put all the contact details underneath this show when it goes out, I promise you, because that sounds fantastic and so relevant right now. And it's really fascinating, I think, how our personal histories, when we record them and get insights into them, can actually heal what's going on now. If you think about what's going on in the world right now, it's pretty horrific, isn't it?
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so I've been talking to some people about it from my own experience and my own processed experience. And they're getting insights in how they may be able to understand this for themselves, because there's a lot of this stuff really present at the moment, really present.
Yes.
So
That's
when those tools and resources are held somewhere, such as this organization, it's really important to share them, because actually that buffers people from having to just take this stuff on and pass it on numbly.
yeah. So should I email you their email address?
It's okay. Send it to Teresa. We got to finish
Okay.
here. I'll sort this out with you just after I finish the show. So let's finish the show and then I'll tell you about practicalities.
Okay.
Okay. So folks, I hope you found that as illuminating and as insightful as I have. I just encourage you to learn this lesson about, the more we know about ourselves, the better it is, particularly those of us that come from backgrounds where there may be intergenerational issues. Silence allows that stuff to grow. We have to give it light. We have to open it up to investigation and talk about these things. It's not a betrayal. Often I think people who grow up in this stuff, they feel if they talk about what happened when they were growing up, they're somehow betraying their parents or their culture, but you're not. You're actually liberating them. You're really liberating them. And your grandmother is liberated by you, without a doubt. She's, wherever she is, she's going, thank you, as we are as well. So you stay there. I'm going to say goodbye to everybody for now, and I'll see you all at the next show. I hope you found that really helpful, and bye-bye for now, folks.